Hi, my name is Patrick Vaughn. I am a Presbyterian minister. Welcome to Scratching the Surface, a series of free flowing, unscripted conversations about race relations. Joining me today is Terrell Carter. Terrell, would you please introduce yourself?
I am a pastor in the St. Louis, Missouri area. I'm also an administrator and professor in higher education, and I'm a former police officer for the city of St. Louis.
This is the third conversation we have recorded about race relations, and we are glad that you've joined us for this one. Terrell, I've been reading in the newspaper lately that as the Black Lives Matter rallies are taking place around the country, there is an increasing number of counter protests. In the state of Washington, for example, in this one small town, some people wanted to put together a Black Lives Matter march, and they were intimidated. Looters will be shot. Statements like that. Another one said, free target practice, and referring to those who are protesting. And in this one particular small town in Washington, an armed militia surrounded them, and they actually had snipers on buildings looking down on the crowd. And the participants in the march said they were incredibly intimidated, and the counter-protesters were claiming, well, we're just here to protect folks against the outsiders. What do you say about that?
This goes back to our last conversation. There is a very clear narrative that is being followed that one of the ironies is we've talked about the language that people use to describe Black people in particular, and that they are the ones at the core of all the destruction that has occurred. But if you look at many of the images that have been shown on television, from videos to pictures, there were as many, if not more, white people participating in the destruction that was occurring. But it's also not just Black Lives Matter. The thing that is being pushed right now or being fought is not just about Black Lives Matter. There's also I hate to use the word underground movement, but it is becoming very well known. There's a word called boogaloo that describes a right wing. It's not as organized, just like Black Lives Matter is not as organized, but it's an not very well organized movement of white militia that is determined to, overthrow, and that may be too strong of a word, but that's how I've heard it described, overthrow the government and to cause dissension. And these people are a part of these. They infiltrate these rallies and marches, and they cause destruction and mayhem. Just a few days ago, a police officer was killed by one of these gentlemen, by a white militia person, as part of this process to start more havoc. My bigger point, though, again, is the narrative that has been told and shared and followed so long is not always right. And, the question is, how do we better educate ourselves, and how do we make sure that we are still speaking up loud enough where the truth can be told, and we can make sure that one thing is not co-opted by another thing.
What do you imagine that they are so afraid of, that when there are some in our society standing up saying Black Lives Matter, others are somewhat compelled to protest that? What's going on? I have a hunch, but I'd like to hear what you think.
So there have been multiple memes that have been going around about it. Not Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, and people have responded, well, if there are 4 houses on the block and 1 house is on fire, yeah, all those houses have value, but the one that's being burned down is the one that requires the most attention. And that's probably the simplest way for me to say what my response is that it goes without saying, there's too much evidence, there's too much data, there's too much everything that shows that minorities, and you and I have talked about this before, I classify and say that it's minorities and the poor are all looked at the same, or they are lumped into the same basket together. And they just clearly are not treated the same way other people groups are. And so the pushback is, life is well for so many other people. We should not necessarily be offended. And a lot of it seems like it's just people being offended, or people don't want to feel uncomfortable or face, history, facts, whatever.
I've read or heard someone say that when you've been privileged, equality can feel like oppression.
There's also the saying that says that racism is so ingrained into the United States that when you push against racism, you are told that you're pushing against the United States.
Mm. It's certainly part of our history.
Right.
Going back 400 years.
Right.
I'm wondering, when people respond so extremely and reactively, and to the point that they're arming themselves, simply because some in our society, thankfully, are saying Black Lives Matter. That tells me that they are somehow very, very threatened. They are very, very afraid. I'm not trying to justify what they're saying or doing. I'm trying to understand it a little bit. Like, what are they afraid of losing, you think?
I think one of the things is power. I mean, power, control, and status. That's more than just one thing. But power, control, and status. When you are asking people to make someone else or allow someone else to become equal, that it's always framed as if you were allowed to do these things, and that means that I'm going to have to give something up, or to improve your life means that my life has to be negatively influenced or negatively, something has to go wrong in order for me to become, or for you to become better. And that's not really true. Again, it's not necessarily an either or always an either or proposition. It can be a both and. Just like I've said before to you that I'm not against police. I just know how police are. But my critiques of the police does not mean that I want a police officer to die. That doesn't mean that I want anything bad. That doesn't mean that I want criminals to run free. What I want is for the people who have been charged with protecting and serving us to treat us all equally. I want when you walk out the door, everything's okay with you. But I also want it when I walk out the door, everything's okay with me as well.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. We were talking last time that when you walk out the door throughout your life, you said that you have been the target of scorn, that people have looked at you with expressions of disgust and fear. Did I remember you saying that?
Something very similar to that. Yes.
So, might not be an exact quote, but it's
in the ballpark.
So, but what I've been wondering about, Terrell, is that's got to get old, like after the first time. And you have been dealing with this your entire life. What gives you the motivation, the hope, the commitment to keep going and keep going? I think we could argue that it's surprising that we've had as little violence as we've had in our society, given the discrimination that African Americans have experienced, the oppression, the abuse in our history. I'm not saying that violence is good by any means, but other societies, I think there would be more. Does that make sense?
Well, I think you're asking a couple of questions, and so let me address the first one. So I appreciate the questions you ask me because it always makes me think. I don't necessarily think that something is an either or. I don't consider myself to be a victim. I don't think you were portraying me as that either. So don't take it that way. I think that it's a daily part of my reality that I have to be aware of who I am and what that means to other people. Now, that doesn't mean that I expect that every hour of the day somebody's going to look at me and run away or clutch their purse or something like that. That's not it. But what I have learned is that when I walk into certain situations, I have to be ready in case something does happen. Again, if I go into a particular community, if I go into a particular store, if something happens, and again, as usual, if I have an interaction with the police, I have to be aware of those kind of things. So I don't think there's any courage in that. I think that there's just, this is what life is. I mean, clearly we wish life was different. Clearly we wish things were completely different, but it is the way life is. So how do you cope? That may not be the right word. How do you adapt? How do you adapt to those things on a daily basis? So that's the answer to your first question. And I've forgotten what your second question was already. Or the second part of your statement.
I forgot it too. The first part was what keeps you going? I mean, where do you get that hope from? Where do you get the commitment, the resolve to keep going when you've been beaten down again and again?
It's just this is life, and I mean, I don't have a choice. I'm not going to sit in the house all day. I mean, I have to go and make a living. I have to. But I think that also I am blessed with opportunities to speak up about these kind of things. I'm also blessed to be in very intentional relationships to try to show people how things can be different.
Mm-hmm.
And, ultimately, my intent is not to sound, overly spiritual, but I truly do believe in God's grace. I do believe in God's ability to protect. Now, if something ever goes wrong, that doesn't mean that God is not God. It just means that life happened. But in the big scheme of things, I really do believe in God's grace, God's protection, opportunity, all of those different things as well.
Thank you. To reiterate what I said a minute ago, I don't want to be misunderstood. And sometimes when I talk, I don't always make as much sense as I think I do. At least my wife tells me that. So I was not by any means implying that African Americans or other oppressed people should respond in violence. I'm just struck that if I had been in that position for generations, that I would be inclined or want to do something. I mean, there are armed militia in our country now who are protesting over what?
Haircuts.
Haircuts, right. Well,
right.
Yeah, well.
But here's the difference, though, is we know that the playing field is not even. So think about this. One of the reasons why, and it's the primary reason why our gun laws were changed in the United States, was not because of what most people think. They were changed because Black Panthers in California started to walk around in the open with guns themselves in order to protect themselves against white people during the 60s. And, they were trying to protect their neighborhoods. They were trying to, not just against white people, let me rephrase that, but a portion of it was against, the crimes that were being committed against them by white people, but they were also trying to protect their neighborhoods against gangs and things like that. So the laws did not change until white people started feeling uncomfortable seeing these armed Black people walk around. My point is, number one, is that's a piece of history that most people don't realize or understand or know about. But number two, it's just another example of the playing field is not even. When minorities do this or do things that make certain people feel uncomfortable, the system is going to respond in a particular way. So that is part of the reason why we've learned through history that, okay, it's okay, or it might be acceptable for somebody to do over here. It's not necessarily right, but be ready that if you try to push against it or try to do it yourself, the consequence is going to be completely different. And so are you willing to put your life on the line in order to do that? Some of us have, some of us have not. But it's, the idea that just because other people over here can do it doesn't necessarily mean you can do it. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's part of the history of this whole process.
Who can do what?
Who can carry guns? Who can, walk armored, in full body armor and over. I'm protesting my First Amendment right to get a haircut. It's not a First Amendment right, but you understand what I'm saying. To protest in certain ways, to respond to authority in certain ways. If I try to do it, there will be very swift and clear consequences versus if you try to do it.
Mm-hmm. You've really helped me to see that in a way that I had not seen it before, and I really do appreciate that. What would you say to the white church today?
There's a whole list of things I would say to the white church today.
We've got like 3 minutes left, so in just a couple of minutes, what would you say to the white church?
I'll pick up on what we talked about last time about this idea of storytelling. Again, yes. Just because you have not experienced the story yourself does not make the story untrue. And listen to see if the story that is being told is consistent. Is it consistently applied, or the rules of the story, are they being consistently applied across everywhere? Somebody posted something on Facebook that I saw, and they asked a question. So how would you respond if your favorite white character was turned into Black, African American, or to some other, or what if your favorite male character became a female character? What kind of response would you have? with those kinds of changes. And I mean, that's a goofy example. But the point though is what is the narrative that we all hold to, that life has to be a certain way in order for it to hold value, or for it to be legitimate, or for our faith to be affirmed, or any of those things. We should start asking ourselves those kinds of questions. And again, I'm not saying have a major discussion with everyone in your community, but I mean, it's one step to take, is just to start asking yourself those types of questions, and just be realistic in what your responses are, and what does that mean?
As a white pastor in the United States, what would you want me to remember from our conversation today?
Number one, that you don't necessarily have anything to feel sorry about. I don't know if that's coming across in the way that I want it to. I always appreciate you, because you are making a legitimate effort, and you have the ability to influence other people. And my hope is that, and I know that you're going to do this, but my hope is that people would do the same thing in whatever their spectrum of the world is. I mean, you don't have to go out and run for elected office. I mean, some of the more positive changes or influential long-term changes is to change yourself, and then to help change the people around you.
Last time we talked about faith and the church in combating racism, and I want to get back to that, but we've run out of time today. But next time I would like to talk about combating racism, and pick up on what you just said, is how do we change our heart?
Right.
And what does that take? What do we need to be able to do that?
I look forward to it.
Great. Again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Patrick Vaughn. This is Scratching the Surface, and we have been joined today by
Terrell Carter.
Terrell, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.